The corridors smelled faintly of floor polish and chalk dust. My new shoes squeaked every few steps, a sound that felt louder than it should have. I kept my head low, clutching my books against my chest like a shield. It was my first day at a new school, 17 years old, and starting over again. I could hear laughter echoing down the hallway, clusters of students greeting each other with easy smiles, like pieces of a puzzle already fitting together. Everyone seemed to know who they were except me. It was 2013. Marriage equality wasn't legal yet in my country, and being open about who you loved could still turn your world upside down. I carried that secret like a stone in my pocket, heavy and hidden. When I walked into English class, the hum of chatter quieted for a moment as a few curious eyes flickered my way. The teacher, a kind-faced woman with bright lipstick, welcomed me and pointed to an empty desk near the window. I sat down, pressing my knees together, pretending to write something in my notebook just to keep my hands busy. Today, the teacher began, smiling warmly at the room. We'll start with something simple introductions. In English, please. Tell your group your name, your age, and one interesting fact about yourself. The word interesting felt suddenly dangerous. I swallowed hard. Around me, chairs scraped against the floor as students shuffled into little clusters. My heart thudded as she divided us into groups of 3. I ended up with 2 girls I'd never seen before. The first one, Lena, had sleek blonde hair that caught the light like polished glass. She carried herself with an ease that made people look twice. When she smiled, it was the kind of smile that seemed to know the world wouldn't dare say no to her. The second, Rosa, was the opposite. Small, quiet, her brown eyes darted around the room as if she was always looking for the safest corner. Her uniform hung a little loose, her dark hair tied in a hasty braid. "Hi," Lena said first, her voice clear and friendly. "I'm Lena. I'm 17. And I like cats." Her pronunciation was perfect, casual. Rosa gave a tiny nod, waiting her turn. "I'm Rosa," she said softly, her accent thick but lovely. 17 too. I like to draw. Both of them looked at me then. My palms were sweating. It was such a small thing, a classroom exercise, but the space between us felt suddenly sacred, like something that could change everything if I said the wrong word. "My name is..." I hesitated, then forced a smile. "I'm 17. My throat felt dry, and my interesting fact is... The words came before I could stop them. "I'm a lesbian." Silence. The classroom around us continued to buzz with laughter and introductions, but in our tiny circle, the air went still. I felt the blood rush to my face, my stomach twisting. Why did I say that? I thought, I should have said I liked movies. Or reading. Anything else. I stared down at my desk, ready to laugh it off as a joke or pretend I'd mispronounced something. But before I could speak, Lena leaned a little closer. "Yeah," she said with a small, knowing grin. I noticed. "I'm a lesbian too." Her tone wasn't teasing, it was soft, almost protective. I blinked, startled. For a heartbeat, I didn't breathe. Then Rosa, still fiddling with her pencil, murmured, "Yeah, me too." She didn't look up, but her cheeks had turned a deep pink. It felt like time folded in on itself. 3 strangers sitting in a sunlit classroom, sharing the same secret the world told us not to say. None of us laughed. None of us looked away. The moment was quiet, unremarkable on the surface, but inside something shifted. We started the rest of the task, stumbling through our English sentences, giggling at wrong tenses and mispronounced words. But everything felt different now. Every word felt lighter, like air after a storm. When the bell rang, we packed up slowly. I wanted to say something to thank them, to tell them that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel completely alone, but all I could do was smile. As I left the classroom, my reflection in the hallway window caught me off guard. My shoulders weren't hunched anymore. That day, I hadn't just introduced myself to two girls. I had introduced myself to me. For a few heartbeats after I spoke, the world seemed to forget how to breathe. The noise of the classroom, the shuffle of papers, chairs creaking, a burst of laughter from another group faded to a distant hum. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. I wanted to swallow the words back, to rewind the last 5 seconds. My cheeks burned. I could feel the heat rising up my neck. I stared at the pencil rolling across my desk, half wishing it would grow big enough to hide behind. Why did I say that? I thought it was just an English exercise. Nobody needed to know that. Then Lena tilted her head, the corners of her mouth curling into the faintest smile. Yeah, she said quietly, leaning in so the teacher wouldn't hear. I noticed. I'm a lesbian too. For a moment, I didn't understand. My heart stopped, then started again with a thud so strong it almost made me laugh. Rosa, still twirling her pencil, looked down at the table. Yeah, me too, she whispered, almost apologetically. Her voice was soft but certain. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was warm, safe. It was as if someone had opened a hidden door in a locked room, and fresh air came rushing in. We just looked at one another, three girls who hadn't known each other 10 minutes ago, and shared a small, incredulous smile. Our teacher moved around the room, commenting on other groups. We tried to act normal, flipping through our notebooks, forcing ourselves to finish the assignment. Okay, Lena said, clearing her throat. Now, one interesting fact about music. Her voice trembled with laughter. I exhaled, the tension slipping out of my shoulders. I like songs with sad lyrics, I said, my English faltering a little. Rosa finally looked up, her brown eyes flickering with amusement. That's every song, she said. We all laughed quietly so we wouldn't draw attention, but genuinely. The laughter broke something open between us. We started talking properly after that. It wasn't about being gay. It was about everything else, books, movies, the weird school uniforms, how bad the cafeteria food smelled. Every now and then, our eyes met, and a tiny spark of recognition passed through. Lena had this calm confidence that made me want to sit closer. She spoke about her dream of living by the sea someday, working with animals. Rosa talked about drawing, about how she liked sketching people's hands because they always tell the truth. When it was my turn, I told them I wrote short stories that no one had ever read. Lena said she wanted to read one. Rosa nodded shyly. The teacher clapped her hands and said time was almost up. Make sure you've written down your group members' names, she reminded us. We scribbled them quickly on a shared page. I caught myself writing their names in neat letters, afraid of spelling them wrong, as if the paper itself might remember this moment for me. As the bell rang, we lingered for a moment while the rest of the class rushed out. None of us said much. We just exchanged awkward smiles that meant more than words. Outside, the hallway was loud and crowded, students spilling out of classrooms, gossiping, laughing. But I felt strangely calm, like I was moving through a bubble of quiet. The sunlight from the tall windows fell across our faces as we walked together toward the lockers. So, Lena said lightly, you survived your first class. Barely, I laughed. Rosa gave a small grin. You did good. We reached the fork in the hallway where our next classes separated us. For a moment, none of us moved. Lena was the one who finally broke the pause. See you tomorrow? Yeah, I said. Yeah, Rosa echoed before disappearing into the crowd. I watched them both go, feeling something unfamiliar blooming in my chest. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something quieter. The sense that the world had more corners of safety than I'd thought. That afternoon, I sat by the window in my bedroom, the golden light slanting across my desk. I opened my diary and wrote, "Today, I said it out loud. I said who I am." And 2 people understood me without questions or laughter. I underlined the last sentence twice. When I put the pen down, I smiled to myself for no reason. The fear I'd carried around for years hadn't disappeared, but it felt smaller, like something I could hold in my hand instead of being crushed beneath. For the first time, I wasn't the only one. The days that followed began to feel softer, like the edges of the world were no longer as sharp. The school still felt large and noisy, the corridors still filled with voices that didn't know her name, but she wasn't walking through them entirely alone anymore. Lena and Rosa, 2 names that had been strangers only weeks before, now carried warmth. They had become her anchor in a sea of uncertainty. They started sitting together in the cafeteria, tucked away at a corner table near the window where sunlight poured in. They didn't draw attention. They didn't need to. While the other students talked about boyfriends, parties, and weekend plans, the 3 of them shared earbuds, swapped smacks, and whispered about dreams they were still too afraid to say out loud in front of anyone else. Sometimes Lena would pull out her phone and say, "You have to listen to this song. It feels like freedom." The narrator would lean closer, hearing muffled guitar strings and a voice that ached with honesty. Rosa would draw in her sketchbook while listening, lost in her own quiet rhythm. They didn't need to fill every silence. Being together was enough. Soon, people began calling them the Quiet Trio. It wasn't meant unkindly. The nickname almost sounded gentle, as if the rest of the world sensed there was something sacred about their silence, but within that silence, something powerful grew, a shared understanding. A small rebellion. One afternoon, the sky was pale gray and the wind carried the smell of rain. After class, instead of going home, they wandered out to the back of the school grounds, where an old oak tree stood alone near the fence. Its branches bent low, casting soft shadows on the grass. They sat there together, their bags scattered around them, the late sun turning their faces golden. The narrator plucked at the blades of grass and said quietly, "Sometimes I think we're invisible." Lena glanced up from her notebook. "No," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear, her tone steady and sure. "We're just waiting to be seen." Rosa smiled, a small, tender curve of her lips. "By the right people," she added. The wind picked up, carrying away their words, but something about that exchange stayed. For the narrator, it felt like a string had been tied between their hearts, delicate but strong. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider standing in the rain. She was part of something quietly beautiful. That night, she opened her diary and wrote with careful, trembling hands. "They made me believe there's nothing wrong with me." Each page of that diary became filled with moments she wanted to remember. The way Lena laughed with her whole face. How Rosa's eyes softened when she was sketching. How their small conversations about the world made her feel brave. There was a quiet strength in their friendship. When they talked about the unfairness of laws, or the way people used words like different and wrong, there was anger, but also hope. "One day," Lena said once, "we won't have to explain ourselves to anyone." Rosa nodded. "And maybe then we'll be able to live the way we want without whispering." The narrator smiled faintly, holding her knees close to her chest. "Until then, we have each other." It was enough. One day, during lunch, Lena brought a disposable camera. "Let's take a picture," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The narrator hesitated. "But why?" "It's just lunch." "Exactly," Lena said. "It's just us like this. I want to remember it." They huddled together, the 3 of them, with half-eaten sandwiches and a sunlight-stained table. Lena held the camera out and clicked. The soft snap of the shutter echoed like a promised dot in that photo. They weren't hiding. They weren't scared. They were just three girls smiling, frozen in a moment that felt infinite. The narrator didn't know then how important that photo would become, how it would someday remind her of who she used to be, and the quiet world she once belonged to. That afternoon, they lingered under the tree again, lying on the grass, their conversation wandering between dreams and laughter. Rosa pointed at the sky and said, "Do you ever think about the future?" "Every day," the narrator answered softly. "But sometimes I'm afraid to." Lena turned toward her, propping herself up on her elbow. "Then don't think too far. Think about right now. This moment." The narrator looked at them, the sunlight in their hair, the peace in their faces, and thought maybe she finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. Not in the way the world defined it, but in the way her heart did in the weeks that followed. Life continued, exams, uniforms, morning assemblies, but for the first time, the rhythm of it didn't crush her, because now there was laughter echoing in the hallways, small smiles exchanged across the classroom, secret notes passed under desks. They didn't talk about love. They didn't need to. What they had was something purer, a kind of quiet courage that helped them survive a world not yet ready for them. Years later, when she would look back, it was this part she'd remember the clearest, not the lessons, not the grades, but the feeling of sunlight on her skin and the sound of her friends, laughter under the tree. The world outside might not have changed yet, but in that little corner of the schoolyard, beneath the branches of the old oak, they had built their own small universe, one built on understanding, warmth, and the kind of friendship that could carry someone through even the loneliest of years. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the world still smelled like it, damp earth, quiet streets, and the faint sweetness of renewal. Morning light spilled through the curtains in soft, forgiving streaks. The narrator sat at the edge of her bed, her hair tangled, her thoughts louder than the silence around her. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes of memory danced behind her eyelids. Lena's laugh, Rosa's shy smile, the sunlight under the oak tree, the way she had felt seen for the first time in years. It was strange how something so long ago could feel so fresh, so alive. Now, as she looked around the room, the framed wedding photos, the rumpled sheets, the quiet hum of domestic stillness, she felt two worlds overlapping inside her. One belonged to the woman she had promised to be, the other to the girl she once was, sitting under that school tree, realizing who she truly was. She pressed her palms against her knees, breathing deeply. For years, she had tucked that part of herself away, convincing herself it was a small thing, something that didn't need to be said out loud. But now, after revisiting those memories, those faces, she understood that it wasn't small at all. It was her husband was in the kitchen when she walked in, stirring coffee, the faint sound of a spoon clinking against the mug. He looked up and smiled, but it was tired, as if he'd already been expecting the conversation that hovered in the air between them. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning." She took a seat at the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The smell of coffee lingered, grounding them in something painfully ordinary. Finally, she said it, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I found a part of myself I've been ignoring for too long." The words came out slow, deliberate, as if each syllable carried years of weight. He set the spoon down, his hand trembling just slightly. "You mean," he began, then stopped. There was no anger in his tone, only confusion and sadness. She nodded. "I think I've always known. I just didn't have the courage to admit it, even to myself." The silence stretched, fragile and full. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I can't say I understand," he said finally, his voice breaking in quiet honesty. "But I want you to be happy." Something in her chest cracked open. Tears welled up, uninvited. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. "I know." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to hold their heart together. And you didn't, not really. You just found the truth. The room seemed to blur around her. She wanted to say more, to explain that what she felt wasn't about choosing someone else, but choosing herself, yet words felt too small for what was inside her. He reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "We had something good," he said softly. "Maybe it wasn't meant to last forever, but it mattered. It always will." She squeezed his hand, her tears spilling freely now. "You're a good man," she whispered, "and I'll always be grateful for you." He nodded, blinking fast, then exhaled a long, weary sigh that carried both sorrow and peace. For the first time, she saw him not as her husband, but as another person walking his own difficult road. And in that moment, love took on a different meaning, not the kind that binds, but the kind that releases. When he stood, he gave her one last lingering look. "Take care of yourself," he said gently, "and be honest, always." After he left for work, the house felt unbearably quiet, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt necessary, like the pause between breaths before a new beginning. She walked to the window and looked outside. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a soft, hesitant blue. Drops of rain still clung to the glass, glinting like tiny prisms of light. She thought of the girl she'd once been, sitting in an English class, blurting out her truth for the first time, trembling and brave. She thought of Lena and Rosa, of their laughter, their courage, their belief that someday the world would understand, and she whispered to herself, "Maybe that someday starts with me." Her reflection in the window looked older now, but also freer, like the storm had passed not just outside, but within her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to hide. She felt whole, fragile, uncertain, but whole. And as she turned away from the window, she smiled faintly, knowing that love, in all its quiet forms, had led her here, to the morning after the storm. The years passed quietly, like chapters in a book she hadn't realized she was writing. By the time she turned 27, her life had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, like her own. The city she lived in now was busier, brighter, and freer than the small town she'd grown up in. Rainbow flags fluttered openly during Pride Month. Couples held hands on the street without looking over their shoulders. And the news had long since declared what once seemed impossible. Marriage equality was the law of the land. She lived alone in a modest apartment on the 5th floor of a building that overlooked a park. Every morning, she made herself coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunlight slip through the leaves. Sometimes, when the air was still and the world felt too big, she'd think about how far she had come from the nervous 17-year-old clutching her books in a new school hallway to this woman who finally knew who she was. She'd come out years ago, slowly, cautiously, and then completely. Some family members had surprised her with warmth. Others had gone silent. Her husband, now long divorced, but still an occasional friend, had remarried. They spoke once a year around the holidays, their conversations kind but brief, both understanding that what they had shared belonged to another time. She worked as a translator now, spending her days surrounded by words and languages, things that connected people across invisible lines. In a quiet way, it felt like she was still doing what she had done back then, finding the courage to communicate truth. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning her drawers, she stumbled across a small stack of old photos. They were curled at the edges, faded slightly from time. Beneath a birthday snapshot and an old family picture, she found it, that photo. 3 girls at a cafeteria table, smiling into the camera. Lena's bright grin, Rose's shy eyes, and herself, in the middle, looking both nervous and happy, as if caught between who she was and who she was becoming. For a long time, she just sat there, holding the photo in her hands. A rush of warmth spread through her chest. The smell of chalk dust, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of laughter echoing down hallways, it all came back in an instant. She remembered Lena's voice, teasing but gentle. Yeah, I noticed. She remembered Rose's hesitant smile. Yeah, me too. And then that silence, not heavy, not awkward, just sacred. The world had felt so different then. Back in 2013, saying the words, I'm lesbian, out loud, had felt like stepping off a cliff. Now, in 2023, those same words rested comfortably on her tongue. But even now, with all the progress and acceptance, nothing compared to that first moment of truth, the quiet bravery shared among three girls who barely knew each other. She traced her fingers over their faces in the photo, her thumb resting lightly on Rose's shoulder. Where are you now? She whispered. She imagined Lena confident. Golden-haired Lena, maybe working in a big city somewhere, still smiling that same unshakable smile. Maybe she'd fallen in love with a woman who made her laugh the same way she used to in class. Maybe she had a cat or two, just like she always said she wanted. And Rosa, sweet, quiet Rosa, she imagined her painting somewhere, perhaps in a small studio filled with sunlight and the scent of oil paint. Maybe she had found peace and stillness, the way she always seemed to. They had been together for such a short time, barely a few months before she dropped out of school. But somehow, that brief connection had changed everything. It was the first time she'd felt not alone. The first time she'd seen her, reflection in someone else's eyes, and felt understood. She set the photo down on her desk and opened her journal, the same kind she'd been keeping for years. The pages were filled with half-written letters, old dreams, quiet victories, and confessions she never spoke aloud. She took her pen and began to write. They were strangers, but in that moment we were sisters in truth. We shared no promises, no future plans, just a flicker of understanding that told me I wasn't wrong for feeling the way I did. Sometimes I think they were the first people who really saw me. Her handwriting trembled slightly, as if her 17-year-old self were still inside her. Guiding her hand, she closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, gazing at the photo again. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a faint rainbow arched over the park, subtle, almost hidden in the mist. She smiled, feeling the poetic irony of it all. Life hadn't been easy. There had been heartbreaks, setbacks, loneliness. But there had also been laughter, community, and love, real. Soul-deep love that didn't need to hide anymore. Sometimes, when she met younger people at LGBTQ+ events, she saw the same uncertainty in their eyes that she once carried. She always told them the same thing. It's okay to be scared. But don't ever confuse fear with shame. Who you are is never something to apologize for. She kept the photo on her desk after that day, tucked inside a small wooden frame. Not as a symbol of what she lost, but of what she found, courage, connection, and the beginning of her truth. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she lit a candle beside the picture. The flame flickered softly, and for a brief second, she imagined the three of them together again, laughing, sharing secrets, unafraid. Time had moved on, and so had she. But the echo of that moment, that tiny revolution in an English classroom, lived on in every part of her. And as she looked at the smiling faces of those two girls, she whispered a quiet promise to them and to herself. I'm still here. Still me, and I hope you are too. The first time she said the words out loud, really said them, not in a diary or a memory, not whispered into the dark, it was to her best friend. They were sitting in a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and rain. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup, watching the steam rise between them like a fragile curtain. Her friend smiled softly, sensing what was coming even before she spoke. I'm gay, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. The words floated in the air, simple, honest, and heavier than she expected. Her friend's eyes filled with warmth. "I know," she said gently. "I've just been waiting for you to say it." They both laughed then, a laugh that turned into quiet tears. And for the first time, she felt the weight of years lifting off her chest, replaced by something light, something real. After that, she told a few others, colleagues, distant cousins, a college friend she hadn't seen in years. Some smiled and hugged her. Others went quiet, the air thick with discomfort. But she didn't crumble this time. Silence no longer felt like a rejection. It felt like proof that she was finally standing in her own truth. She moved into a small apartment soon after, a sunlit corner on the third floor with peeling paint and creaky floors. It was the first place that was hers alone. No shared furniture, no compromise of color or space, just her books, her music, her art on the walls. Every corner held a small freedom. She bought a secondhand record player and filled her shelves with old vinyls, the kind of music that made her 17-year-old self feel brave. Sometimes she'd dance barefoot in the living room with the windows open, the city sounds blending with the melody. She had learned at last to enjoy her own company. One evening, she sat on her couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through her messages when a new notification appeared. It was from a name she hadn't seen in years, the redhead. Her heart skipped. She opened the message slowly, her pulse quickening like it used to when she was younger. "Hey, I saw your post the other day, the one about being true to yourself. I just wanted to say I'm happy for you. You seem free. Take care of yourself." That was all. No question, no invitation. Just a small, kind note from the past. She read it twice, then smiled. The words didn't ignite longing anymore. They didn't reopen old wounds. Instead, they felt like closure, a quiet, beautiful echo from another chapter. She typed a short reply, "Thank you. I am. And I hope you are too." Then she set her phone aside and leaned back, letting the silence fill the room. It wasn't the story she once imagined, no grand reunion, no dramatic love confession, but it was enough. Because she finally understood the real love story wasn't between her and anyone else. It was between her and her own truth. Weeks later, she found herself at another concert, alone again, but not lonely. The crowd around her pulsed with life. The stage lights painted her face in colors that shifted like moods, gold, blue, crimson, white. The bass vibrated through her chest, and she closed her eyes, letting the music move through her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought of that first concert, the night that began everything. How terrified and alive she had felt. How she'd mistaken a moment of discovery for the destination itself. Now, standing there under the lights, she realized discovery was never supposed to end. It was a journey messy, beautiful, and infinite. When the crowd started singing along, she joined in, her voice quiet but sure. Around her, strangers swayed together, each one carrying their own stories, their own hidden battles. She felt connected to all of them and to the girl she once was, the one in the English classroom, the one whispering her truth, the one who thought being different meant being alone. A tear slipped down her cheek, but it wasn't from sadness. It was gratitude for every mistake, every fear, every moment of courage that brought her here. The lights dimmed between songs, and for a heartbeat, the world went dark. She looked up at the ceiling, the beams of light cutting through smoke, and smiled softly. She whispered to herself, just loud enough to hear over the fading noise, "I once thought my life ended the day I admitted who I was. Now I see that's the day it began." The band launched into another song, faster, brighter. The crowd jumped and cheered, and she found herself laughing, not because of the music, but because she finally felt at peace inside her own skin. Later, walking home beneath the night sky, Her ears still ringing and her heart light, she caught her reflection in a shop window, older now, wiser, a little softer around the edges. And she realized something she had waited her whole life to understand. She didn't need someone else to complete her. She had already done that herself. Standing under the glow of the streetlights, she took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air on her skin. It took her 30 years of confusion, silence, courage, and growth to arrive here at this quiet joy. And as the city pulsed softly around her, she smiled and whispered the truth she had finally earned. It took me 30 years to fall in love, not with a person, but with myself.